Thank you very much.
I'm still hoarse and I'm coughing.
Should we get you something to drink or something?
No.
Let me say for the tape that I'm Sara Tucker. This is January 25th, 1991. This is an interview with Betty Jo Charlton of the 46th District, representative of the 46th Kansas District, member of the House. This is being recorded. The transcript of this interview will be submitted to Representative Charlton. Any changes she wishes to make will be made, but then it will be deposited at the Kansas State Historical Society, it will be deposited at Washburn University, and it will be used for scholarly research. Now that we've said that, what I'm really interested in is hearing about you as a person and your experiences as a legislator. And I would like to start just establishing your legislative identity. What year were you elected to the House?
For the 1980 session, I was appointed to fill out the term of a House member who had resigned midterm. And 1980 being an election year.
Right.
After the session was over, I went right into an election campaign, and so I was actually elected for the first time in 1980.
Ah, okay.
And so the 1981 session was the first year of my first full term.
Okay. Well, let's back up then and ask how it was you got appointed to this district.
Well, Douglas County has been sort of the cradle of republicanism in Kansas. It was settled by the Free Staters before the Civil War, and by abolitionists from New England, and they were Republicans. And there had always been a strong predisposition to the Republican Party in Douglas County. And however, there was one man elected to the Kansas House when George Docking from Lawrence became governor in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
No, I beg your pardon, 1950s. And with the election of Governor George Docking and a representative, you found an upsurge in political activity in the county.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going way back with this.
That's wonderful.
Previously, there had been very little political activity at parties outside government in the county because the Republicans didn't need to organize and work because they were going to win anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
Local offices were determined in the Republican primary. The Democrats weren't organized or active because they had no hope of winning.
Mm-hmm.
And usually didn't even have candidates. It's hard to get someone to run when the person knows he's going to lose.
Yes.
So when Robert Docking ran for the first time in 1966, the county chairman, who's my brother-in-law, promised the Docking people that he would at least have candidates for the state legislature.
Okay.
And it turned out that that he had to run. Douglas had 2 seats then. He ran for one himself, and he was going to ask his 80-year-old mother to run for the other seat, and I said, you can't do that. It looks like you don't have a friend in the world except your mother. And so I got stuck with it. And so I thought, well, the thing for us to do is to do the very best we can, and if we do fairly well, it will encourage other
Mm-hmm.
Democrats to file. And I began at that time to work toward trying to build a 2-party system in Douglas County. And I thought, well, he just didn't try very hard to find candidates. And so by the time I got through the 1966 campaign virtually on my own, I had a lot of data about the voters and the breakdown by precinct in the district. And so I searched for a candidate for 1968. Mm-hmm. No one wanted to run. So I ran again.
Mm-hmm.
And I was running against a white male Republican,
Mm-hmm.
a white-haired man in his 60s. I was in my 40s. He was a good legislator, and it was kind of like running against God because he put down first of all on his announcement that he was an elder at the Trinity Lutheran Church, and the second item for his qualification was that he was on the board of directors of his church college. And but the last time the Democrats had a candidate against Mr. Vogel was about 1962, and that candidate had about 27%.
Mm-hmm.
I got 42% in 66, and I got 44% in 68. And in 1970, we still didn't. Robert Docking was running for a third term, and we didn't have candidates. And a senior at KU, a young man, came to me and said, "Were you going to run for that House seat again?" And I said, "I hope not." And he said, "Well, I was thinking about running." And of course, I could have kissed him. I welcomed him with open arms. I sort of managed his campaign that time. He got about 49%. He was literally running for his life, because if he didn't get elected, he got drafted. And he went into the Army for 2 years, and the reapportionment took place, and I looked at the new district as the third representative from Douglas County, and I said, when you get home, Mike, you're going to move into this new district. And I started getting his petitions out, and he started campaigning when he got out of the Army in June, and he was elected.
And this is...
As far as I know, it was the second time a Democrat was elected from Douglas County to the Kansas House. And so, you see, that was 72. So it took 6 years to elect one Democrat. But since then, we've gotten an organization in place, we've gotten candidates, and from 1980 to 1990, we had 3 Democrat representatives from Douglas County in the House.
Goodness.
And when Mike Glover decided to resign effective January 1st, 1980, he said, "Well, I would just Betty Jo's done a lot for me, and I would like to do something nice for her, and she is my choice to be appointed to fill out my term."
Very good. So now, very clearly, you come from a Democratic family.
No, I do not. I am the only registered Democrat in my immediate family.
Good heavens.
Well, I was born in Kansas.
Well,
and you're likely to be born a Republican if you're born in Kansas in the 1920s.
Why are you a Democrat?
Well, for one thing, my brother-in-law convinced me that we needed to build a two-party system in Douglas County. I didn't have very strong feelings of party identification, because I knew my father had voted for Franklin Roosevelt twice in the 1940s, and sometimes I think, though, that what actually changed caused me to change my party affiliation was Adlai Stevenson's speech to the American Bar Association in I believe it was 1964.
That sounds right. About anyway. Yeah.
I read it in the newspaper. I wasn't there.
So your brother-in-law was a Democrat who
Actually,
married
it's my
into
husband's brother-in-law in Lawrence. Yes.
Your husband's
Dr.
brother-in-law.
Richard Nelson.
And this brought Democratic activists into your life. And
When they saw that we were able to get more than 40% in an election, then they began to think, well, maybe it's not. Particularly with me, I think in 1960s they thought, if that woman could get 42%, maybe I could win.
Possibly so.
Incidentally, that first time I ran, I think there were only 5 or 6 women running for the legislature statewide, and only one woman was elected. Harriet Graham from Wichita.
Harriet Graham.
There was one woman in the House, and of course no women in the Senate, until now Congressman Jan Myers was elected in the, I think, early 1970s, and for many years she was the only woman in the Senate.
So you were doing what a lot of women are doing now, earlier than many, many women were doing.
You might have called me a pioneer.
Is there something, how does this fit with your own family background? I'm talking about your parents, the role models you saw as a child. Where do you think this openness of yours came from?
Well, we certainly, my sisters and I and our cousins were not treated the same as the boys in the family, and it was expected that we would marry and be housewives all our lives, which I did, and I didn't work outside my home for 16 years while my children were growing up. But political activity, my grandfather was Republican county chairman or at least precinct committee man, I don't know. He went to political conventions. He was a delegate to a national convention. Grandpa saw to it that everybody in the family voted. And we were a family who voted. We were rural people in Reno County. And then my father was probably for 30 years the Republican precinct committee man for Plevna Township, and then for about 20 years he was on the town council and the mayor of Plevna, Kansas, which is a very small town west of Hutchinson. And he had served on the school board when I was in grade school and high school. I think that Dad and Granddad may have set an example for us of public service.
And your mother?
Locally, mostly. Mother worked on the election board, things like that, and helped Dad with his mail and duties as mayor.
But other than that, she did not work outside the home?
No, she did not.
Now, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have 2 sisters and 1 brother, all Republicans.
Even now, I take
Well,
it.
they haven't seen a reason to change party affiliation. My brother lives in Oklahoma, and I have a sister in Missouri and a sister in West Virginia. But we all, in our voting, cross party lines. I know how they tell me how they vote, and that probably goes back to Dad's voting for Franklin Roosevelt, I suppose.
How were you educated? Where and to what level?
Well, Plevna Rural High School, which no longer exists. It's been a unified school district out there now. 1 year at Hutchinson Junior College, and 1 year at University of Kansas, and I was enrolled in aeronautical engineering, which was I was the only woman enrolled in aeronautical engineering. When I came up here, there were 4 other women in the engine school, and at that time there was no separate school of architecture. So, and the other 4 besides myself, and they were all architecture students. And but I married a Lawrence man and dropped out of school. What do you do with an aeronautical engineering degree if you're going to live in Lawrence the rest of your life? And when my children got up in school age and all, I began to ask myself, why would you live in Lawrence the rest of your life and not finish, not go to school? It's right here. So I started going, taking courses at the university part-time, and eventually got a bachelor's degree in political science and eventually a master's degree in political science.
And did you then, as your children were out of home and into school and so on, start being employed outside the home?
No, I had been employed for many years before I was married. I was still 15 years old when I graduated from high school, and well, yes, I did take shorthand and typing at a private secretarial school in Hutchinson, and then I worked in an insurance agency in Hutchinson, and then at Cessna Aircraft in Wichita during the war, and I was 22 years old when I came to Lawrence as a sophomore at KU.
Oh my!
And I was working then half-time at an insurance agency in Lawrence, and I continued to work. And well, in effect, I married the boss's son.
Okay.
And when my father-in-law died, he and I were both still working in the office for a while after I was married. And I continued to work occasionally part-time in my husband's office through those years, like when some of the employees were on vacation. but outside of that, I didn't work outside my home until while I was a graduate student, I was a graduate teaching assistant in Western Civilization program. After I finished my master's degree, I continued to teach one class each semester, even after I took a seat in the House, just as I was called a freebie. I think unpaid adjunct staff or something like that. It's kind of fun teaching one class a week after having taught 8 classes a week. That was half-time teaching when I was doing graduate work.
Yeah, I remember.
So besides the teaching Western Civ and occasional part-time work in my husband's office, I didn't work outside my home.
Okay. Now I know how you got into politics, and I know how you got into office. Turning to your experience as a freshman legislator, freshwoman legislator, whatever it is, what was the Kansas legislature like when you got here in 1980? Especially in terms of being a woman, but just whatever seems to you important about it.
Well, I already knew that a lot of the changes had already taken place, such as the establishment of the Legislative Research Department, which Kansas sort of pioneered among the states, and the fact that the state office building had been built and that members now had offices other than their desks on the floor, and a lot of those changes I was aware had already been taking place. Plus, I beg your pardon, I did, in the 1977 and 78 sessions, I worked as secretary for 3 representatives, and then let me see, Carlin was elected in 1978 the first time. All right, for the 1979 session, I worked in Governor Carlin's office.
So you knew a fair amount.
So taking a seat in January of 1980, I had been working up here during the legislative sessions for 3 years, and I was aware of the issues, and I was actually, what I was doing in the governor's office was helping track legislation, and so I think I had an advantage over most freshman legislators. I knew where things were, and I knew there was no orientation for people coming in midterm.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I did take the orientation offered freshmen the following December, but I found that I was already aware of most of the things that were brought up.
What committees did you ask for? What committees did you get?
Well, of course, Mike had been in his 4th term, and knowing full well that I would not be appointed to his committees, I asked for them anyhow, which were Ways and Means and Judiciary. So, no, they moved incumbents up to those positions, and they somehow made room for me on the Local Government Committee and the Transportation Committee.
Okay.
And freshmen tend to try to get off local government as soon as they can, but I still put transportation down on my preferences. But my first choice in the 1981 session was Energy and Natural Resources. I was appointed to that committee, and I'm still on it. I served, meanwhile, I continued on transportation for 5 or 6 years. I was on apportionment when the congressional districts were apportioned in the early 1980s and in the judicial districts. And I served on the Elections Committee. It was an assignment that no other Democrat was willing to take at that time. And I was on the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations for several years, and I was ranking minority member on that committee, and I gave up my ranking minority status to get off that committee. I think every member should spend at least 2 years on that committee to become familiar with the bureaucracy and how it operates, but 6 years was cruel and unusual punishment, I thought, and I asked for the Tax Committee, and so I gave up my ranking status on Rules and Regs in order to get on the Tax Committee, which has turned out to be a very important assignment. And for the past, I think this is about the third term. At that point, I was about where I wanted to be on committees, and I've asked to be reappointed to the 4 committees, and I have been ever since. It's somewhere along there. I forgot to mention I got on Federal and State Affairs. Okay, so my committee assignments now, and for the past about 3 terms, are Energy and Natural Resources, Federal and State Affairs, Taxation, and Apportionment. And this term is going to be unusual for apportionment because, I believe for the first time, the committee we will be working on legislative and congressional and judicial districts in the same term. And so that's going to be busy.
I bet it is.
Hasn't started yet, but it's going to be busy. And of course, the tax committee is very, very busy.
You clearly then have, partly maybe by planning it out and partly by just seeing what worked, come up with the kind of role you want to play here. Can you tell me what it is, what issues it is you think you're serving, what role you think you're playing in the legislature? For example, you clearly do not seem to be on women's issue committees for whatever reason.
You're right. When I took a seat, and I think even yet, it's because some women members ask for these assignments. But there was still a tendency to put women on education and public health and welfare, thinking that these are the kinds of things that women are good at, or these are things they're interested in anyhow. Well, I think coming in and midterm that way, I just had to take what they gave me. I was the only woman on transportation, and if you will recall at the meeting yesterday, Representative Everhart said she's the only woman on transportation, and I forgot to remark, well, the Transportation Committee hasn't come very far in 10 years.
Doesn't sound like
11 years.
So this is more just your personal style. This is what you're interested in.
I'm a generalist. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know very much about anything. I am not a specialist. Although, in political theory, and much of the time up here, if I stop to think about it, doesn't seem to be much relationship between what I'm doing and what I studied. But on the other hand, once in a while I see American political theory working and in action, and it strikes you all of a sudden, here it is, and it works.
Well, it doesn't work.
And I sort of asked to be changed committees every few years during the past decade because I wanted to study and work on a broad range of issues and different kinds of issues, and learn as much about the different facets of government and problems of government, state government that I could. So rather than worrying about building up seniority, I've done committee hopping, sort of. And but as I say, I think 2 terms ago, I got the place where I wanted to be, and have perhaps developed a little bit of expertise in environmental affairs and tax affairs.
They're going to be important committees, that's for sure. How do you get things done here? Originally, did you have a mentor? Are you a mentor for people? Are you part of a kind of major focus or interest group? What is your style, and how have you gotten things done?
Well, I've never been particularly interested in personal glory either. I think I was already aware before. You have a lot of candidates running for the state legislature, and to hear them on the campaign trail, you'd think they're coming up here and set the world afire as freshmen. And I already knew that it doesn't work that way, that no one person can get anything through the legislature, and that you have to work with people, and that you have to make compromises, and that it takes time. A new idea is introduced, and it may be 4 years, it may be 10 years, or 20 before it's it's an idea whose time has come. And so I tend to work with other people the best I can, without worrying about whether or not I'm recognized as a leader or or as getting personal credit for any legislation. Whenever possible, I get a bill introduced as a committee bill.
Mm-hmm.
Committees don't always report out their own bills, but once the committee has put its stamp by simply introducing the bill, it's more likely to get out of committee.
Mm-hmm.
For example, that's perhaps an example of how things work. If you really want to get something done, you don't worry about whether or not your name's on the bill. You worry about getting the bill introduced and getting it through.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me some bills that you feel you've contributed to?
Particular bills?
Or
it's been so long. I think I feel one of the things I'm most proud of is that I was on the House Committee on Energy and Natural Resources when the water plan, the first time the state has ever had a successful water plan, was initiated not as a single document but as an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since we started it in 1981, the legislature continuously reviews and revises that water plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was on the committee and I was on the special interim committee 3 years ago, I guess was when we came up with a funding plan. We had a state water plan, but it wasn't being funded out of the general fund,
Mm-hmm.
and we came up with a state water plan. A funding mechanism for the state water plan. And when Mr. Harkins, the director of the water office, the first week of this session, outlined it for the benefit of new members, I think, on the committee, outlined the history of the state water plan. I had a feeling of satisfaction sitting there, realizing that I'd been in on it from the first year,
mm-hmm.
since
Mm-hmm.
1981.
Circling back to you as an elected official, you got appointed. Since then, you have done real well in getting reelected and reelected and reelected. Can you tell me what it is about your district, about you, about how you run, that has produced this very good record of being reelected?
Well, I think that perhaps any freshman is most vulnerable at the end of the first term. Mm-hmm. And this was at the end of half a term. And so the nearest I ever came to losing was the 1980 election. The district lines had changed,
mm-hmm.
But then I had served only 1 year. My opponent had run against Glover the year before, mm-hmm. so he had gained some name recognition there. However, I have name recognition because my husband was in business under his own name in Lawrence. Excuse me. That doesn't make so much difference now. But after having a close one that first time, I decided that we would run the campaign every time as if I were a brand new candidate that no one had ever heard of before. Okay. Because we used to have a lot of stable neighborhoods in Lawrence. The east part of town, not near the campus, mm-hmm. We no longer have that. Mm-hmm. There are people moving in and out.
Just a second. Let me give you a chance to clear your throat and so on. And I will turn. I can come back. There is no reason on earth for you to. Now, you were talking about your, I guess I'd call it re-election strategies, and describing the neighborhood, which keeps changing, I take it now.
Well, yes, there are older neighborhoods east of Massachusetts, in the east part of the city and North Lawrence. There are growth areas, and those neighborhoods are no longer stable. They used to be. A lot of students live over there now. There's a growth area out southeast, then precincts right around the campus, of course, have a turnover maybe as much as 80 or 85% every 2 years. And I'm talking about election years. It's every year with the students moving in and out.
Yeah.
And so the thing that, well, I'll tell you what really brought this home to me and made me realize it. When I was appointed to take Glover's seat, Glover had been a very, well, he'd been the flashy type. He was, the news media found him to be a good copy, shall we say. He had his name in the paper a lot. So I got, there were a lot of big stories in the newspaper and on the radio around Lawrence when he resigned and when I was appointed to take his seat. And full-page story and picture of me and my life in the Sunday paper and so forth. And I knew they were doing this because Mike had been some sort of sensational, and they wondered if I would be the same kind of person, same kind of legislator. And which not, Mike and I agreed on a lot of issues, but we had a complete, his style was completely different from mine, and I warned them that it would be. Well, that's the most publicity I've ever had before or after.
Okay.
But I had a lot of you might call free publicity in December and January. So by the August primary, 8 months later, what you do, it's customary that candidates go down to the courthouse and see the results come in, even though you don't have a contest yourself in the primary. And I was standing, now Senator Wentworth was running for a House seat. And he and I were standing by the board where the results were chalked up, and I saw some lights going off, and I thought, good, I'll get some more free publicity. They're taking my picture. And as I went to leave the courthouse, the photographer came up to me and said, ma'am, we were getting some pictures of Went there, and I believe you're in one of them. Would you give me your name and address? So I gave him my name and address, and I did not tell him I was a candidate. In fact, I was an incumbent. I simply went home and said, don't take anything for granted. They were not taking pictures of me. They were taking pictures of Went. But, of course, the free publicity didn't really help because I won, he lost that election, but so much for free publicity. But you must never assume anything. You must not assume that people know who you are. And so we've run every campaign as if I were new, and we needed to tell people who I was. Although I found, of course, this past election, the 1990 election, we ran in districts with new lines, and 5 precincts were added to the 46th district because it had lost population. And as I found as I went into the new areas in the fall of 1990, that I had a lot of name recognition. As I went door to door, people came to the door, they recognized me. But not all of them, but a great number did. But we still ran the campaign as if I were a new candidate, as if I were not an incumbent. Except that, of course, you have your record to talk about, and you have your record to be attacked upon.
Yes. Now tell me about some issues. You said you shared many issues with your predecessor. What issues do you feel are important for you, important in your district, and so on?
Well, of course, his last session was 1979. I was talking about at that time.
Yeah.
He was out front on a lot of social issues and environmental issues then. For example, in the 1970s, he had introduced a bottle bill, what we call a bottle bill. This is that the containers have to be returnable. We still don't have a bottle bill. We've started last year, in the 1990 session, for the first time, the legislature actually passed some recycling legislation. And so that was some 14, 15 years after he had introduced a bottle bill.
Okay.
And so, yes, environmental issues he was interested in, so was I. And of course, we've got wrapped up in the tax problems, and I feel we can make taxes more fair.
How?
Well, by amending the amendment we made to the Constitution and taking out exemptions, because the exemptions caused an unfair shift to commercial and residential real estate. The problem is, as I see it, people keep talking about the reliance on the local property tax is too heavy. The heavy reliance is not so much on the local property tax, because we've increased state aid over the years to local school districts and to local units of government. The heavy reliance is on the real estate, because almost all other kinds of property, there's motor vehicles left, of course, have been exempted from the local property tax. And so we're talking about broadening the base of the sales tax now, and we need to broaden the base again of the local property tax, and rather than pump money into it for property tax relief. And I don't know how successful I'll be. A lot of members share my ideas about this. This year I've discovered already in tax committee, but realistically, we probably won't be able to take those exemptions out of the Constitution. We can maybe modify them to some extent, and then you just have to compromise. But actually, it should never have been put in the Constitution.
Indeed. How would you describe the power structure and the situation of women when you got to first get to know the Kansas legislature, and now, and how much and how do you think it's changed? It's a big question, any way you want to do it.
Well, since I've been here for the session every year, beginning with the 1977 session, I haven't been aware of change, except that we were gaining in numbers of women in both chambers. It's probably like a child is growing, and if you live with that child, you don't notice the progress he's making. But if you see the child when he's 2 years old and you see him again at 12 years of age, then you would notice a big difference. But I haven't been away from the place in the past, 14 years. And so, that is during the sessions. And I really am very busy, and I haven't taken time to stop and think about that.
Okay.
Yes, I'm aware that we now have women in leadership positions in the House. Donna Whiteman is the first woman to be a floor leader, but before that, Rochelle Chronister was the Republicans' assistant floor leader, and so it's been gradual that way. And I was not surprised, and nor really particularly impressed that Donna became floor leader. I kind of expected her to, and I'm pleased. We have more women in the chairing committees, but it's happened gradually.
Do you see any difference in style? And this is something that some women have commented on and others have not. I'll give you just an example. One woman told me that she believes she had very little impact as a legislator, but that she thinks her style of campaigning, responsible reaction to her constituents, really changed the style of what it took to campaign in her district. Do you see any style changes that you think might come from partly women being here?
You mean of the whole legislature and the way it operates, or the
Or
image of the
it?
legislature, or how you campaign for the legislature? That's a separate thing.
I'm collecting any insight you have. So any area you think you see something, or the fact that you don't think you see something.
Well, I think it's more individual than gender related with me anyhow, because they still attack me, and I realized finally after the 1988 election that this was a common sort of buzzword nationwide against women candidates. She's not a leader. Leadership was the buzzword. She hasn't exhibited any leadership qualities. Okay. I would be a leader. And I simply tell them sort of what I told you earlier in this interview, and I go a bit further perhaps. If you're looking for personal glory, don't go to the legislature, because it's all a matter of teamwork and working with people and persuading people. There is such a thing, persuasion is needed, but mostly a matter of cooperation. And if you, there have to be people in what we call leadership positions around here. Somebody has to run the place. And people who get into the leadership positions are usually, in the past it's been usually young men. We have young women in them now, for which I'm very pleased with that. But in the past it's usually been young men who were ambitious for higher office. They wanted someday to run for governor or Congress, and so they worked hard to get into leadership positions in the House and the Senate, state Senate. And they, when you get into one of those leadership positions, you tend to neglect your constituency. You haven't time for your constituent services. You haven't. You can't put your own district or your own community first. You have to follow the party line at that level. We don't have strict party discipline in any American legislatures, any state legislatures or Congress. But when you're in leadership, you're expected to help formulate party policy and to follow it. And we had an example a few years ago with a young man from Manhattan who was a very promising young politician. He probably would have run for governor or Congress sometime in the future, and he would have been a good governor or congressman. He had a bright future in politics. He got into leadership. He was forced to vote against his constituency at some point. He was tacked on that in an election, and he was defeated. And as far as I can see, his political career is over. And so, you take your choice. Do I want to be a big shot in Topeka, or do I want to serve my constituency? And that is the way I answer now the attacks on before I simply didn't bother to answer. I just campaigned hard. But now we have more and more. We have public forums, and some of them are televised or on the radio, and I know they're reaching some of my constituency. Normally, the way we used to have public forums before election was that there would be 4 or 5 organizations around town, League of Women Voters, maybe the Teachers Association and so forth, who would have public forums, and about 100 people went to each of these, and most of those people were the candidates' campaign managers and the families of the candidates, and a few people like League of Women Voters members who were interested, and it was kind of the same people, and not very many people from my district, but you still had to go because the newspaper covered it. But now it's different. You reach more people. We do have a local cable vision station. The forums are broadcast, and so it makes a difference. And I've discovered that a few years ago that if someone accuses you of something, no matter how preposterous it is, that if you do not reply, and it's said over and over in public, a lot of people are going to start believing it. So I realized I was going to have to answer things. And that's kind of the way I handle the leadership pushing. And I think women are, by and large. Men campaign against women on this premise: I will be a leader. She is not capable of being a leader.
Mm-hmm. And if I'm understanding you right, in terms of what I was maybe assuming or implying, then you would see that some women have had opportunities to play roles that used to be male roles, but that the style of the legislature has not been changed simply by having some women come here. That basically men and women are still playing the same choices of roles.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I hadn't given it any thought, but offhand I would say I don't see a change.
Because a lot of people have several times in our history said, if we can get enough women in there, things will be different because we will act differently.
Well, we probably have to have 51%.
Well, I'm willing to see that happen.
Me too.
I do want to ask a catch-up question before I move on. When you were working very hard in your district, the first time, second time, and all the way through, what kinds of people helped you? You mentioned League of Women Voters. I know some women have had that kind of organization helping them.
Now, the League doesn't get involved in partisan elections.
Right, but...
as individual members,
groups, yeah.
As individuals, they can, if they don't have an office in the League. That's the way the League operates.
I sort of misstated. What I should have said is that I often hear that the Women's Club or any women's organization, all of them came out, Junior League all came out, that sort of thing. Did you have any women's organizations or any groups you belonged to that produced your supporters who walked around and did it for you?
No.
No.
And I have, I get letters from the National Women's Political Caucus asking me for money. And I've had to tell them, let's help all women candidates. I've been a candidate for public office many, many times, counting those 2 times in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And no state or national women's political caucus has even contacted me. And so, but I didn't resent it or anything. I didn't expect it. They never had. It didn't exist when I first started working in election campaigns. And I worked in election campaigns from 1966 on, whether I was a candidate or not. So I was an experienced campaigner. And believe me, it's easier to campaign for someone else than it is to do it for yourself. It is for me, anyhow. But, as I said, when I started, there was really no local organization to speak of. And we have gradually, over the past 20 years, built up a local organization that helps. And we have to, a lot of them are students. And we have to re-recruit every election because the students move on, they graduate, and they move away, and it's personal friends, people, students, and other young people in the community have joined Young Democrats, and they never have a large membership roster. We have a few of them working hard, and another thing, some people who go to Lawrence to go to school are kind of like I am. They stay there the rest of their lives, or they come back there to live later on. And if they've worked in election campaigns before, they'll get in touch with you. Well, I'm back in town. I'd like to work on your campaign.
So you just build up a...
You build up a sort of political base locally, and in our community it changes with, as I said, with the student population and all, but you have a small core of involved people. Then you try to expand that in election year, but most people completely lose interest right after the election. And so you have to recruit again every 2 years. And so we always have some new people, and I always have a few old faithfuls.
For many people, one of the hardest things about being in the legislature is the impact on their personal life. And I know, because you told me before we started recording, that you were married for 38 years. You are now a widow. You have a family, children. How did you fit in your career in the legislature with your family life? Were there any problems? How did you organize all this?
Both sons had moved away from home before I took a seat in the legislature. And my husband and I just worked it out. I had taken phone calls at home for him at that point for more than 30 years, and so incidentally I commute. I came home every night, and so he took calls for me, and when I learned to work things out, I think was earlier when our sons were still in grade school and high school, and I was taking courses at the university. I decided in a very traditional way that if I were going to school, it was not going to make any difference in the way we lived at home. And so I chose my courses according to whether or not the class met during the hours that the boys were in school, so that I would be there to pick them up at school and be at home with them. So it was going back to school that I had to work around family life more than later on. And my husband was very pleased about my becoming a member of the House of Representatives, and he was proud of it, and he was glad to help. He was no good at campaigning. He really would have made a much better candidate than I, because he had a much nicer personality than I have. And he had a lot of friends, but actually, to tell you the truth, we couldn't afford for him to do it. He sold insurance for a living, and we could afford for me to come up here because I have no other outside business or profession or employment. But I just thought that I would kind of get this in, that most of our members here serve in the legislature at financial sacrifice, because most of them still are men, and some of the young women are lawyers or business women, and they are losing income 3 to 4 months out of the year when they come up here to serve in the legislature, and the expense money probably doesn't quite cover their expenses, those who have to stay, who live a long way and can't drive home every night like I do. And I made no financial sacrifice to do it, and my husband was cooperative. Well, I'd say he wasn't involved. He was a registered Republican, and he kept his registration that way. And that made it kind of handy because he got all the Republican mailings, all their literature in the mail, and that way I could tell what the Republicans were mailing out. But it wasn't just that reason. He saw no reason to change. I don't think he had a real strong feeling of party identification. But it didn't take a lot of adjustment. Well, also, I'd been working up here during the sessions for 3 years before I took a seat. And I think that he felt that if those 3 years' work up here during the session somewhat prepared me for taking a seat in the House, and he also felt, I think, that my education had prepared me, and I don't know, I think just life experience prepares one, and that he cooperated, and I really I didn't have the home duties even in 1980 that I would have had earlier, or that many men and women both have. And now, of course, I feel very fortunate to have had the seat in the legislature, and in 1984, after his death, to have had to go right into an election campaign in order to keep my job, because it seems to me that a great many women who are past 60 who lose their husbands, after a few weeks they sit at home alone a great deal of the time. I have been too busy to, and I feel very fortunate to have had this to do for the past several years.
How has it affected you? How have your personal abilities, your personal outlook changed thanks to 10 years in the legislature?
I don't know that serving in the legislature has changed my outlook on life as much as finishing my education. I mean, going as far as I could with it. I saw no reason to go ahead and start on a PhD or go any further in graduate school because I thought at the rate I went I would be reach retirement age before I got my degree. But I don't know that formal education does this for everyone. I don't know that it may make a difference what field you're studying in. But I think as I continue to study and pursue formal education as an adult, it had more impact on my life and on my outlook on things than my involvement in business or government.
So this is a natural progression from what you'd already been doing, it sounds as if.
I think so, and some people say, well, in government or in the legislature, that's not the real world. Well, it is really, and maybe coming from the campus to the real world of politics, you're further broadened. As I said, sometimes you think, what in the world? What is the connection between this and theory of government? And then all of a sudden you see it and you realize that you know what you're seeing, and there is a connection. I think that as time went on, I stopped looking for final answers, stopped looking for complete solutions, and learned to be satisfied with sometimes with half a loaf. And I don't think I ever was a person who insisted on having my own way, but I still grumble that things are not as they ought to be. Maybe I talk about that too much, because one thing my opponent said in the last election is, I'll be a person of action up there, instead of just talking about how things should be. So I thought, well, that's the way I've come across to him, that I'm a person who talks about how things ought to be. But I think just one's life experience teaches one to accept things, as I say, accept the incompleteness of things. And you may feel some gratification that you've contributed toward partial solutions. Incidentally, usually we're asked, what would you advise young people to do, whether to go into government politics or not, And I tell them, if you're looking for instant gratification, don't. You can go out and you can go into one of the helping professions, serving mankind. You can teach. You can be in the health-related professions.
It's all right. It'll keep on going as soon as it quits beeping.
Oh, you can, and you feel good right away.
Yes.
You've helped somebody, and you can see the results of your efforts.
Yes.
It takes many years in the legislature to see the results of your efforts. Often it does.
Let me ask
Such as even on election campaigns. As I said, it took 6 years after I started to work on saying, I would like to see a Democrat from Douglas County in the House of Representatives.
Yes.
It took 6 years.
Yes.
So you don't look for instant gratification.
Very briefly, has being
Is
in the
that
legislature...
still running?
It's still running. I'm watching it go. Has being in the legislature changed the way you think people see you or relate to you? Your being in the legislature.
Well, more people. No, I know more people. That's another nice thing about it is you get acquainted with a lot more people than you would have known otherwise. And people call me and ask me to help them with their problems with state government, so I get acquainted with them that way. Yes, I don't think I was ever looked up to, except maybe by my own children before, by anyone, or expected to help. I was not the oldest child in the family. I was a middle child, and the middle kid is often occupies a position of no significance in the family. I don't think I ever felt that I didn't worry about it a lot, but it was, I think after I was grown I realized that.
Mm-hmm.
That middle kids sometimes have a tough time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, I hadn't occupied any position of authority before in my life. I don't now, but some of the people in my district who feel I am their link with state government do feel that I'm in a position of authority, and sometimes they expect a great deal more of me than
Mm-hmm.
I can do. For example,
Okay.
I get called, they're not picking up my trash. Well, but that's the city government's job. But they feel that I have jurisdiction somehow over the city government.
Or maybe they think you know somebody.
Or they say, I tried the city hall and they won't do anything. Won't you help me, Mrs. Charlton?
Mm-hmm. Is there something I should have asked you? That
Oh, I kept bringing in these things.
and that's what I wanted.
I can't. Well, the interview's been good for me in that you got me to thinking about some things that I don't usually take time to think about, such as what difference do women make here? And I'm sure that there are differences that I take for granted. And as I say, they've come about gradually while I've been here. And it just occurred to me, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm the dean of the women in the house now. I'm not sure. Is there another woman who's served longer than I have?
I am not sure there is.
I'm not either. I hadn't even thought about it until right
And
this
I need
minute.
to find out. Certainly it's
It's
interesting.
not
that-
important,
Yeah,
but
no.
it's just that I just happened to think of it.
You don't seem particularly. Okay, in that case, I will just ask you. You do seem not to have played your cards right, and I presume you didn't want to play them right. You have not become a leader, and in a length of time that might have not only made some young men, but some young women a leader. Do you have any ambitions?
That
in
may
the
be
House?
one difference. You said, is there a difference between 1980 and 1991?
Yes.
That women coming in then, in the 1970s, and up to 1980 and past just a little while, perhaps we were just amazed to find ourselves in the state legislature, much
All right.
less be ambitious for a leadership job. We felt like, we'd accomplished quite a bit then. And I belong to that generation. I think maybe it's a generational difference.
Mm-hmm.
That, and also it may be just some of my personality. As I said,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see myself as a person seeking personal glory or authority. It may lead back, as I may have suggested a while ago, to childhood and your position in the family.
Mm-hmm.
That I was not a person who was given a lot of responsibility or expected to look out for the younger children. It may be that may be it. Perhaps their attacks on me in the election campaigns are justified when they say she doesn't have any leadership quality. I think I work just as hard as a lot of the people in the leadership, in these leadership roles. In fact, as far as representing my district and my community, I think I'm more on top of that than I would be if I had a leadership position in the House.
Is there something you would like to accomplish in the House you haven't yet? Do you have some goals here that you see yourself achieving the next few years?
Every time election year runs around, I'm asked, why are you running again? And I have to say, well, I have some unfinished business up there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm beginning to realize that I'm going to retire someday and there will still be unfinished business.
Well,
And,
when should you retire? I mean, do you have an image of how long you should be here?
no, I hadn't thought about it, and I think that the 1990 election was the first time that an attempt was made to make my age an issue in the campaign.
Now, would you
Not
state how old
because
are you?
I'm a woman, but
Yeah.
because of my age. I was 67 in June. And a lot of people, 65 is sort of thought of as a retirement age, you know, and not mandatory, but probably most people do. And I hadn't even thought about it. Now, the United States government makes you very conscious that you've turned 65 by sending you all that Medicare literature. Otherwise, when you're in the middle of any decade of your life, you don't really even realize exactly how old you are. It's when you hit this, 40 or 50 or 60 that you're aware of how old you are. But I hadn't thought about my age, and there was, they've really had a hard time finding anything wrong with my record or that they could run against me in my district. And so they've tried to pick on these things of she's not in a leadership position, or, and as I say this last time, well, my opponent showed the poor judgment of having some of his strategy sessions in a cafe 20 feet from Democratic headquarters, and of course people from there were listening. They were sitting at the next table, and so and they said, "Well, you've got to make an issue of the age." And the young man who's running against me said, "I can't. She's preempted it. She's done me like Reagan did Mondale. She's brought it up herself." Because they asked, "Why do you think you should be elected?" And I mentioned, "I have experience, judgment, and maturity." And he said, "She talks about maturity. I can't say anything about it." And so then they tried to start the rumor that because I had name recognition, I was running again. But she's going to resign as soon as the election is over, and they're going to appoint a younger Democrat to take her seat. Though I were on my last legs, and they didn't get very far with that. The newspaper refused to print it, and so they tried it by word of mouth, but as I say, age became an issue for the first time in 1990. As far as I know.
Very interesting.
As far as I know.
So women is not particularly an issue, but age is now on the horizon.
Well, in my case, it has been now. Representative Shagru, who retired last year, was in her 70s. Representative Branson retired last year, and she was 70 years old in December. And being younger than both those women in the House, I didn't. My age being a problem hadn't occurred to me. But I suppose I'll be conscious of it from now on.
Well, that's a very nice finish to this interview, and I thank you very much. Let me tell you one thing. Now, I wouldn't check this probably before.